Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back to my channel, where today we're going to be talking about the decade-old case of Paige Johnson. I was actually contacted to do this video by Paige's best friend, who is desperate to get as much attention on this as possible in an attempt to finally get it closed and get justice. Paige's family, especially her daughter, deserves some closure here. I will be leaving a link to the GoFundMe for Paige's case in the description box down below. If you're in a position to be able to donate, I'm sure her family would appreciate it very, very much. If not, just watch this video, learn Paige's story and help spread awareness. That will be more than enough. Anyone with any information in this case is asked to call the Covington police, or if you want to remain anonymous, you can call Crime Stoppers, and I'll leave the numbers for both in the description box down below. You guys are always pretty respectful anyway, but I'm just going to say this because I was contacted by someone close to Paige to do this video, and I would hate for them to read rude or unsettling or upsetting comments. So just be nice in the comments. If you don't have something helpful or positive to say, then just don't say anything at all. I know that can be hard for some people on the internet, but the last thing we want to do is to upset the family further and make all of this harder than it already is. My channel is a safe space, it's a kind space. We're trying to help bring more public awareness to Paige's case, so just be aware of that. So Paige Johnson was just 17 years old when she was reported missing to the Covington Police Department in Kentucky on the 23rd of September 2010. For the next 10 years, despite strong suspicions, nobody knew what had happened to Paige, where she had gone, if she was even still alive. Until the 25th of March 2020, when authorities received a call from a woman who said that her husband had come across a burned human skull whilst deer hunting in a wooded area in Ohio, near Williamstown and Highway 276. Local authorities conducted a 2-day search, and the rest of the human remains were found nearby, sent to the Hamilton County Coroner's Office, and soon identified as Paige Johnson via dental records. She was found only 30 miles away from where she'd been reported as missing 10 years earlier. Although her family were obviously devastated, I do think you always sort of hold on to that small hope that your loved one will eventually be found alive. They were relieved in a way to finally have a small amount of closure after their decade-long ordeal. After a decade of Paige just being missing, now this was a different type of investigation. This was potentially a homicide, and they were on a mission to find out exactly what happened. Was this a murder or was it accidental? How did Paige end up where she did? Paige Johnson lived with her family and her 2-year-old daughter Mackenzie in Florence, Kentucky, which is the second largest city in northern Kentucky and just southwest of Covington, the largest city in northern Kentucky. She was fairly small, just 5'1" and 110 pounds, in fact the exact same size as me, and I can say from experience it's pretty easy to be overpowered by anyone of even average height when you're 5'1". Paige's life had been pretty rough in the couple of years before her death. She'd gotten pregnant young, and as I mentioned before, she now had a 2-year-old daughter, and she'd only just turned 17 a month before she went missing. As much as Paige absolutely loved and adored her daughter, it was hard being a teenage mum, it always is. And according to an article written by Pilar Melendez for the Daily Beast, she'd actually had to drop out of Simon Kenton High School to care for Mackenzie. Paige was still adjusting to this new life, and being a mother brings new challenges every single day. One of her high school friends told the Daily Beast, Paige was a social butterfly in school. She was always taking the time to talk to people and always had a smile on her face. It wasn't out of the ordinary to see her at parties after she left school. She was always a joy to have around. Paige was just a very social person, and from what I can gather, she did still live with her family, so she did have that bit of freedom where her family could look after Mackenzie and she could still go out and socialise on occasion. One of those occasions was on the 23rd of September 2010. That day, Paige called her best friend to ask if they could hang out, but she was with another friend and so she couldn't. She said in her email to me that this was very normal for Paige, that she was just trying to get out of the house and maybe get away from her boyfriend for a little bit. So, of course, being the social butterfly that she was, Paige ends up accepting another offer to hang out with some other friends. This was just a casual gathering, or maybe a party at a friend's house it seems, and she was there for a few hours until she left with another friend, a 22-year-old man called Jacob Bumpus. Paige knew Jacob through her older sister, and he'd also been the one to take her to this party, picking her up from her mum's house early that evening. According to her best friend, Paige had told her friends that she'd felt uncomfortable around Jacob, but she was always trying to hang out with older people. I think a lot of us can relate. When you're sort of in your mid-teens, you think that it's the height of coolness to hang out and socialise with people in their 20s, a few years older, and Paige probably would have loved this. Authorities would later say that it was pretty difficult to find out what actually went on at that party that night, because everyone was drinking, a lot of attendees were underage, and some of them were even on drugs. Therefore, pretty much everyone has a different story of that night, and a clear timeline has never really been able to be created. According to whathappenedtoPaigeJohnson.com, there have been many rumours over the years that multiple friends saw that Paige had actually passed out at the party, and so had to be carried out by Jacob Bumpus, and potentially there was even a second young man helping him. It seems that Paige's sister Brittany believes this, saying, "She didn't deserve what happened to her, and Jacob Bumpus and one of his close friends know exactly what happened to her, yet refuse to come forward. I know there are other people who know what happened to my sister that night. How they sleep at night is baffling to me." When Paige's family woke up the next morning, they realised that Paige was nowhere to be found. Her friends and family start calling round everyone they could think of to see if anyone knew where Paige was. I mean, in a situation like that, I think most would assume that she just crashed somewhere else and failed to let her family know. But no one knew where Paige was. Her best friend herself called Jacob to ask if he'd seen her, and apparently he acted completely oblivious and just showed a complete lack of concern as well. So it wasn't long until Brittany, Paige's sister, called the police to report her as missing, who, from as far as I can tell, actually did take the case very seriously from the beginning. All too often we hear about police dismissing missing teenage girls as runaways, and that's that, but it seems in Paige's case they did actually take it seriously, and almost immediately turned up at Bumpus's door to question him. Makes sense, seeing as he was known to have left the party with Paige that night. As you would probably expect, he denied knowing anything of Paige's disappearance, saying he dropped her off at 15th Street and Scott Boulevard in Covington at 1 a.m. This was at least 15 minutes away from her home, so why he dropped Paige off here instead of just taking her all the way home? I'm not too sure. One article with CBS News states that he told police he dropped Paige off to visit a friend, but if this was the case, Paige certainly never made it to a friend's home. So naturally, Bumpus's phone records were reviewed. What the record showed, to no one's surprise, was that he was not telling the truth. Phone towers showed that he was actually near Paige's home in Florence at that time, around 1 a.m, and not in Covington at all. His phone also pinged a tower in Batavia, Ohio at 4:13 a.m, and then 5 minutes after that, it pinged off another tower near Half Acre Road, also in Batavia. It was also found that he sent a text message from East Fork State Park in Clermont County in Ohio about 4:28 a.m. that night. He would later explain his location here, saying that he decided to go fishing. This spot in East Fork State Park would later transpire to be just 1.5 miles away from where Paige's body would be found 9.5 years later, despite the park at the time being searched with cadaver dogs and the William H. Harsher Lake being cleared. That lake is more than 100 feet deep in some parts. There were more than 100 searchers at the time searching the park on ATVs, foot and horseback, but nothing was found. The park is Ohio's largest state park, covering almost 5,000 acres, and that's a very big area to search. In the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, Paige's friends and family conducted their own searches. They made ribbons to raise reward money, and they walked the streets knocking on people's doors, talking to literally anyone who'd be willing to listen. They themselves searched rivers, creeks and dumpsters and heard all sorts of rumours about what had happened to her. But for a decade there was nothing in this case apart from some very strong suspicions. A $3,500 reward was raised for any information leading to the discovery of Paige's whereabouts, and in the following weeks and months the family covered their area in missing posters. Any surface a poster would stick on, you would find one. They were desperate for any information about Paige. In November 2010, CBS News stated that investigators were seeking search warrants for Paige's and Bumpus's Facebook and MySpace accounts, hoping that messages sent via the sites might lead them to Paige. Covington Police Detective Gwen Kelly wrote in an affidavit that she thinks the accounts might contain information that a criminal offence has occurred, saying, "Investigators found Mr. Bumpus's limited statements to be true or unverifiable. Mr. Bumpus was unwilling to provide an explanation of the whereabouts of Paige Johnson." The same article also pointed out that phone records showed ongoing communication between the two prior to Paige's disappearance, but after she disappeared, there was nothing at all, nothing after the 23rd of September. Jacob Bumpus was not named a suspect in Paige's disappearance at the time, nor was he ever arrested for anything in relation to it. He has never cooperated with investigators. He was arrested in November 2010 on a parole violation for possession of deadly weapons, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, and lying to parole officers about where he worked, and then he was eventually released from prison for that in 2012. So we're not exactly dealing with the most law-abiding citizen here, to say the least. A Fox 19 article from the 13th September 2011 states that Paige's mother, Donna Johnson's attorney, was planning to sue Bumpus in an attempt to get him to open up, but for that to happen, Paige had to be declared as deceased. There were plans to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Bumpus, but he simply pleaded the Fifth Amendment, essentially not having to testify against yourself if you're accused of committing a crime. There are some differences between pleading the Fifth in a civil case and a criminal case, but essentially in a civil case, refusal to answer any questions can be used against you in determining liability. So pleading the Fifth doesn't really mean much in a civil case, and I think that's how they were trying to trip him up. But as far as I can find, nothing ever really came of this plan. In 2012, a possible tip about Paige's disappearance led investigators to an area just outside of Barbourville, so 180 miles south of Covington. It was a wooded area just off of KY 229 near a farm. A very large area of bush and overgrowth was searched. Buckets of dirt were literally sifted through looking for any sign of Paige, any clue. But as we know, Paige wouldn't end up being anywhere near here. By the time the search had ended, a 6 to 8 foot deep hole had been dug the size of an Olympic swimming pool, but to no avail. This must have been a fairly reliable sounding tip for so much energy to be put into this search, but despite this, nothing was found. Covington Police Chief Spike Jones said, "A great many resources were devoted to this search, but they were not wasted. As we approach the 2-year anniversary of Paige's disappearance, it's important for the public and Paige's family to know we have not given up. Most importantly, the person or persons out there who know where Paige is need to realise we will not give up until we bring Paige home." But the years went by and there were no huge leads in this case. Each month the police were receiving between 1 and 3 tips, and the case remained open. The police and Paige's family circulated flyers, never giving up hope that someone might remember something. The family hoped that as the young people at the party that night got older and had children and families of their own, their conscience might persuade them to come forward and share details they might have skipped before. From what Paige's best friend has told me, the police were actually very proactive in this case. Like I said earlier, so often you hear stories of police dismissing missing teenage girls as runaways and not bothering to take anything seriously, but in this case they really did. It is relieving to hear that the detectives involved in this case took it very seriously. Apparently the first detective in this case was very helpful and didn't want to pass on a single lead. And whilst it did take investigators a while to come speak to Paige's best friend, they did take her seriously and got some answers they said would be helpful. The second detective apparently didn't do much, but the third detective was also very good. He would call Paige's best friend often and discuss names and people who might have been involved. Her best friend found out that Jacob had actually been going onto the What Happened to Paige Johnson Facebook page under an alias and spamming it with comments about how he was innocent and calling Paige a plethora of different names. Investigators found this information very interesting because he was clearly still keeping track of the case even years later. In January 2020, representatives from the Centre for Missing and Exploited Children visited Covington PD to go through Paige's case file, and they suggested that the best course of action was to just start the whole investigation from square one. Nothing could be gleaned from the information they already had, so they said it was best to start from scratch, build up an entire case again from nothing. So that's what the PD did. Around that same time, Paige's story was also actually featured in an episode of the Vanished podcast, getting her story out there to up to 300,000 listeners, which is huge for a case such as this one. The podcast goes really deep into Paige's family history, into her childhood and the context around her life in Florence, and I would recommend listening to it if you want to go really, really deep in this case. However, my aim in this video is just to get the facts out directly related to Paige's disappearance, and I'm not too sure how relevant her childhood and even her parents' childhood is in regards to the actual events of September 23rd. But the podcast does add interesting background for sure, but I just don't want to really add murkiness to the facts in this video by delving into all of that. But if you do want to delve really deep into this case, that podcast is fantastic. The Vanished, I'll link that down below also. It would just so happen to be 2 months after the Vanished episode was released and after the Centre for Missing and Exploited Children looked at the case that Paige's body would be found purely by chance. Her body being found wasn't the result of any big lead or fantastic police work, it was literally just chance. The skull was originally found on the 22nd of March 2020, and by the evening of the 24th, Hamilton County confirmed that the remains had been positively identified as Paige. Her family were notified the very next morning. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this was a time of mixed emotions for her friends and family. Donna Johnson, her mum, said, "I've been waiting to bring my baby home for so long and now I get to. This is a day that I was so worried that I would go to my grave without ever getting." She said it was overwhelming sadness and happiness at the same time, just mostly knowing that she's not out there alone anymore and Paige could finally be laid to rest. Luckily, that is not the end of this case. Just a matter of months after Paige's discovery, on the 28th of July 2020, now 32-year-old Jacob Bumpus was arrested on charges of abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence after evidence was presented to the Clermont County Grand Jury. Bumpus was taken into custody without incident after a routine traffic stop just before 1 a.m. in Hamilton County, Ohio. The Sheriff, Robert S. Leahy, said in a statement, "Working on the original search at East Fork Lake in 2010 and following this case for 10 grueling years, I am thankful that my office was able to work in conjunction with the Covington Police Department to bring Bumpus to justice. It is my sincere hope that this helps bring a sense of closure to the family of Paige Johnson." Bumpus was held in the Clermont County Jail without bond to appear before a judge for an arraignment hearing at 10 a.m. on July 29, 2020. Although he was never officially named a suspect in this case, the Kenton County Commonwealth prosecutor Rob Sanders told WXIX-TV that he was always the main suspect in the case. He said during a news conference, "This is a big step. It's a step that I looked forward to for almost a decade now. I always suspected that Mr. Bumpus has been at least aware of what happened to Paige, if not responsible for her death. However, it was also noted that whilst he may face additional charges in the future, it's very unlikely that they'll be able to bring forward a homicide charge unless investigators can discover how Paige has died. And as far as I'm aware, they still don't have that information. In front of a judge the day after his arrest, Bumpus pleaded not guilty to his charges and his bail was set at $50,000 cash, which his mother actually used her home to post. He was freed under the condition that Bumpus had absolutely no contact with the Johnson family. As of the day I'm writing this, so the 3rd of August 2021, there has not yet been a trial. I did read that proceedings have been delayed because of the sheer amount of evidence being gathered, and I can't find any information about when it is actually predicted to start. The last post on the What Happened to Paige Johnson Facebook page from the 8th of February states that they were hoping the trial date would be set that day, but there haven't been any updates on that page since. I'm hoping that the reason for the delay is that they're working on more evidence and potentially trying to get enough to charge Bumpus with homicide rather than just abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence, but I'm sure the pandemic has also contributed towards the delays as well. At this point, even if he does get convicted, it's not going to be of homicide, and I feel that Paige deserves more than that. And so do her loved ones as well. Paige's daughter Mackenzie will be coming into her teenage years now, and she deserves closure to know exactly what happened to her mum. Just because someone has now been arrested in connection with this crime, it does not mean that this is the time to give up. In fact, it's more important than ever that people come forward with any information they have. Anything could help the case against Bumpus at this point. We don't know if he's directly responsible for Paige's murder or manslaughter, or if it was an accident and he's covered it up. We don't know if there was another person that left the party with Paige and Jacob that night. A lot of people seem to think there was. Who was this person and what did they have to do with this? What we do know is that investigators are very certain that Bumpus was involved somehow, that he knows something about what happened to Paige that night. Anything could be a huge help right now. So the investigation continues. Anyone with any information is asked to contact the Greater Cincinnati Crime Stoppers, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, Covington PD or Crime Stoppers. All numbers will be down below.